Tea has been described as a history-changing plant, and indeed from its role in revolutions to the part it played in the smuggling business, and even to its status as the delivery mechanism of choice of various 19th century poisoners, tea does lie at the heart of several momentous occasions. So it's somewhat unsurprising that tea would have also accrued a range of superstitions, particularly through its role within fortune-telling, magical properties and even medicinal remedies. So let's go and investigate them in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We are cracking on with this month's theme of the folklore of drinks, and after looking at beer last week, I thought we would switch to a non-alcoholic beverage this week and do tea. And truth be told, I'm more of a coffee drinker, but I have more recently gotten into flavoured teas, so there is that. Now, I am just going to jump into this week's episode because there is quite a lot to cover. And tea is not simply the go-to comfort beverage, particularly in the UK, and yes, it is quite amusing how often somebody will just offer to put the kettle on whenever there's been some kind of calamity. Bill Laws actually describes tea as a history-changing plant, and he's also not wrong, but the history of tea is quite a big topic and I don't really want to waste time talking about that, so if you do have a look at his book 50 Plants That Changed the World, that would be a really good place for you to find out a little bit more about the history of tea. And if you do have a look at Bill Law's book 50 Plants That Changed the Course of History, you will obviously get to find out a little bit more about the history of tea. Now, I do want to note, while I said I'm not looking at the history, that tea does have a really long history, perhaps possibly more so than many other beverages. And according to some legends, it was Emperor Shen Nung who discovered it in 2737 BCE, so that is quite a long time ago. And the earliest records about tea include a preparation guide that was written during China's Tang dynasty between 760 and 762 CE. So, it's obviously been quite popular for a long time. And I did want to note, and I love Samuel Pepys for all the wrong reasons. He's a funny figure in history, I think, but one of the things that is helpful is because he was so diligent in writing his diaries, and some of them are really boring, but because he mentions these momentous things in his life, we also then get to kind of date them with when people were actually aware of them. So he had his very first cup of tea on the 25th of September 1660, which he did record in his diary, and in 1667 he actually noted that an apothecary had recommended it to his wife, saying it would be good for her. So you can see how it took just 7 years before people were starting to sell it almost as a health remedy. And indeed, Dr. Samuel Johnson also praised tea's good qualities in 1757, so like I say, it's obviously been a favourite for quite a long time. But in this week's episode, we are going to have a look at how it shows up in folklore, folk remedies and even divination. And yes, there will be a spot of poison at the end of the episode, because let's be honest, it is me we're talking about, and tea is a plant. So while tea itself is not poisonous, it has been used as the delivery mechanism of choice for various poisons throughout the centuries. So we are going to start off with tea and predictions, because perhaps tea is most associated with fortune telling outside of just drinking it. And a whole range of superstitions and predictions accompany both tea and the ritual of drinking it. For example, a teaspoon placed upside down on a saucer indicates that you will hear news of a close relative's bad health. But teaspoons can also be quite helpful, because if you want to predict when a marriage will happen, then balance a teaspoon on the edge of the cup. Drip tea 1 drop at a time onto the spoon until the spoon then falls into the cup. And the number of drips that it takes to dislodge the spoon is how many years it'll be until a marriage happens. When stirring tea in a teapot, you must stir it clockwise, because if you stir it anti-clockwise, that can stir up conflict. And you shouldn't stir anyone else's tea, as you then risk falling out with them. And obviously it goes without saying that you should only ever use a spoon to stir tea, as it's bad luck to stir it with anything else. When it comes to what else you were putting in your tea besides tea, women were advised to put sugar into the cup before milk, otherwise they would never marry. And if a man poured more than 1 cup of tea for a woman on the same occasion, she'd become attracted to him. I can't help thinking that a man possibly put that one about, but there we go. Two women sharing a teapot had to be careful, because if they both poured tea from the same pot, one would soon become pregnant. And if you put 2 teaspoons on the same saucer by accident, it indicated a wedding or a pregnancy on the way. And if you accidentally drop a teaspoon while making tea, it predicts a pregnancy for someone at the gathering. But no, it doesn't count if you do it on purpose. You should leave the lid of a teapot open if you want to receive visitors, and likewise leaves floating in a cup of tea actually meant the visitors would be on the way as well. And a tea leaf or a stalk floating in the tea is called a bow, so if you then stir the tea with a teaspoon and the bow sticks to the spoon, it means that a male marriage partner will arrive. Now obviously they're all sort of relatively positive ones, but you shouldn't drain a tea kettle dry or it'll bring bad luck. You should also avoid spilling milk when you add it to your tea, or that'll bring you bad luck. And breaking a teapot is a sign of trouble. Married couples should beware if a kettle spouts water while boiling, because it indicates a quarrel on the way. And if you boil a kettle on your wedding day and it boils over, then you'll be a sour wife. Now those last two are from sort of 1903, so I think that gives you a bit of an idea of how people felt about the people who would be preparing tea. Now, brewing tea more strongly than usual suggests the start of a new friendship, but making it weaker will see the end of an existing friendship. Fishermen believed that if they emptied the teapot before they set off, the fish wouldn't bite, and if the family emptied the teapot before he left the house, the men would be lost at sea. So obviously that all sounds a little bit doom and gloom, but it's not all bad, because if you spilled the tea itself while you were in the process of making it, that was considered a sign of good luck, and if you see bubbles on the surface of the tea, then that's great. So if they're in the centre of the cup, it's a good financial omen. And I was quite pleased to hear that one, because I made a cup of black tea with mango yesterday and it did indeed have bubbles in the centre of the cup. I'll let you know if that was a good financial omen or not. But if the bubbles are at the side of the cup, it means that kisses are coming from a loved one. If you can scoop out the bubbles on a teaspoon and then lift the spoon out without touching the cup's sides, you then need to try and swallow the bubbles before the pop, and if you manage that, then you'll get a letter with good news. That all sounds a little bit too much for my liking, but there we go. Now obviously I have within those particular predictions, and they are really quite static and they are very similar pretty much everywhere that you find them, so it's quite interesting that there's not many contradictory ones among them. So clearly someone came up with a series of predictions and everyone stuck to it. But where we talk about tea leaves floating in the water obviously makes us think about the art of reading tea leaves, and that's called tasseography. And that actually started in ancient China, and essentially at its heart it requires you to look at the patterns that the tea leaves make inside the cup once you've finished drinking the tea. It eventually appeared in Europe after tea became popular in the 17th century, and because all you needed to actually do it was a cup, a saucer and some tea, it did become an easy type of fortune telling to try. Naturally, the Victorians obviously jumped on this and started producing cups which actually had symbols on the inside of them to try and help people decode what they were looking at, and indeed you can buy cups like that even now on Amazon. But you do have to remember that tea was not cheap when it was first introduced. So at first, it wasn't as accessible in the way that palmistry or even playing cards were, and it only became more accessible as the price came down. Now, reading tea leaves is actually referred to as a primarily female pastime during the 18th century, although it did become more common in the 19th century. And due to the manuals devoted to tea leaf reading, obviously many of the signs are very similar as well. So again, because it sort of came out of the same moment, you don't have quite the same contradictions as you do with something like the language of flowers. Now, some people think that the drinker actually infuses the tea with their energy, much like shuffling a deck of cards imprints their energy on the reading. And then it also works best with loose tea, because obviously you get much better images with the tea leaves that are left, because the tea in tea bags is way too finely ground to make it any use at all. And obviously it does go without saying that you shouldn't use a tea strainer or a teapot with an internal strainer, because you actually want the leaves in your cup. So the basic premise is this: you should make your tea using your loose leaves and then leave them in the cup and then drink your tea. Hooray, you've done the first bit. Then you leave a teaspoon or so of tea in the cup, so you want a little bit of liquid at the bottom, and then you hold the cup handle in your left hand and then ask your question in your mind. You swirl the liquid in the cup anti-clockwise 3 times. Then you need to put the saucer over the cup and invert it, leave it for a minute to let the tea drain out, and then right your cup back up the right way up again. And now you can read the leaves as they're left in the cup. So you recommend it to see if any shapes leap out to you, which ones grab your attention, what ideas pop into your head as you see them. I'm not going to go into what all the symbols mean because it's quite extensive, but you can find out what they mean in a good guide to tasseography, like Caroline Dow's Tea Leaf Reading for Beginners, Your Fortune in a Teacup, which was an absolutely indispensable source for this post. Now, obviously, we're talking about fortune telling as some fun little diversion that you can do. And indeed, obviously, in the 18th and 19th century, it obviously was a little bit of a parlour game for some. But it does also have links with sorcery. And I did have to put something like this in, obviously. But Amy Henrietta Lake was actually the last woman to stand trial for witchcraft in Guernsey in 1914. And it's all thanks to tea. So Sarah Charrington Hollins relates the tale in her book, The Dark History of Tea. And according to her, a woman named Mrs. Houghton believed that she'd been cursed for not paying a debt of £3. Now, bear in mind, obviously, in 1914, £3 would be a fair bit of money. But she'd incurred the debt by buying some magic powders from Amy Lake after the unexpected death of her husband and the recent deaths of her cattle, because Mrs. Lake read both tarot and tea leaves, and she sold charms made from kitchen cupboard ingredients to make a living. After Mrs. Houghton had all these horrible things happen to her, she went to see Mrs. Lake for some kind of guidance, and then Mrs. Lake said to her, yes, you have been cursed. And she then sold her one of these charms that she'd made after reading her tea leaves. Mrs. Houghton took the charm, but it seems that she didn't pay, which then led to Mrs. Lake to suggest harm would come to her if she didn't pay up. So instead of paying the debt, Mrs. Houghton went to the police about her instead, and Mrs. Lake was accused of disorderly conduct and carrying on the trade of fortune-telling and witchcraft, as quoted in the book. Now, she did deny the witchcraft charges, but then the powders were tested and found to be really common ingredients like baking powder, and they decided that she was therefore making mischief by selling these as magic powders. So she was then sentenced to 8 days in prison. Obviously, this was not a particularly fun time for her. She did have children to look after. She was pregnant at the time. But I suppose 8 days in prison compared to what would have happened to someone even sort of 400 years earlier does obviously demonstrate how far the belief in witchcraft had gone at that point. Now, thankfully, there's very little stopping you from making magical use of tea in the 21st century. And some people mix black and green teas with other herbs for magical results. For example, you might add rose petals to a black or green tea to help heal a broken heart, or you might add lavender to help promote relaxing sleep. You can actually add dry tea leaves to your pillow to make sure that you'll sleep well, and some people actually thought that you could halt nightmares and negative thoughts and even sleep disturbances by doing exactly this. And also, if you are looking for a way to bring a bit of extra money into your life, and I think we're pretty much all in that boat at the moment, Sarah Charrington Hollins actually recommends that you hold a handful of black tea leaves. As you do so, you should visualise money as an easy flow that comes to you while chanting "money come, money flow." Once you feel that the tea has been charged enough, you can then just brew them as usual in your favourite teapot, and then you should visualise being wealthier while you drink the tea. If anyone does try that, please do feel free to let me know if it works. And as Teresa Dietz gives another simple spell, that you should simply wear a pouch of dried tea leaves as a talisman to increase your strength, and it'll also apparently give you a boost of courage. And when you consider the properties that tea itself actually has, you can see why people would think that would work. And it does just show that witchcraft ingredients don't have to cost a fortune or be extremely rare to have any kind of effectiveness. Now, obviously, you don't just simply have magical remedies for tea, and tea does appear in some folk remedies as well, and also just some general superstitious practices. So, for example, Ruth Binney notes that it was considered a bad idea to throw away tea leaves. So in bygone eras, housewives would actually put them on the fire and burn them to keep poverty at bay. Otherwise, it was believed to bring penury to the house if you threw your tea leaves away. But that isn't all that they're good for. And this is a lot of these come from Caroline Dow's book, but you can mix black tea leaves and sage to create a hair rinse for dark hair. And green tea, obviously a cool one, as a hair rinse can apparently actually fight dandruff due to the antioxidants in it. If you've got sunburn, then wash your face in cool black tea to help ease the pain, and the tannins in tea can also help soothe sore throats and mouth ulcers. And indeed, washing your face in warm tea will apparently help open any blocked pores. You can rejuvenate tired or puffy eyes by laying cold chamomile or black tea bags on your eyelids, while green tea bags can be used on sweat rashes and mosquito bites to lessen itching. And you can actually deter mosquitoes by burning tea leaves on an outside grill. If you've got any kinds of sores, swelling, aches or fungal infections around your feet, you can make a foot bath with black tea, salt and lemon, which will soothe them. And if you soak your feet in peppermint tea for 20 minutes, it will eradicate any smells. Used tea leaves also make a great odour absorber, so you can sprinkle used leaves that are almost dry on the carpet, then let them dry fully, Once they've done that, sweep them up and you'll find that they've refreshed your carpet. Otherwise, you can put tea leaves in a bowl in the fridge and they'll absorb smells there as well. You can also finally enrich a compost pile with spent leaves, or you can use them to fertilise peppers, roses and camellias. And I also think while I was writing this episode, I did sort of think, yes, and I'm pretty sure anybody of my age also remembers the fact that you could use a tea bag to artificially age paper when you were at school if you needed to make a treasure map or anything that looked like antique paper. But that's probably more of an arts and crafts thing than a folk remedy. But let's end this episode with a spot of poison, because that's where Fabulous Folklore often goes. And there was almost like a case of accidental poisoning just simply through the act of using a teapot, because silver teapots were the preserve of the upper classes with their elaborate tea rituals, and the lower classes therefore had to use pewter, which is a tin alloy that also contains lead, antimony, copper and bismuth. So lead and antimony will not do you any good whatsoever, because lead builds up in both the bones and the soft tissue and it can damage the nervous system. And also antimony is vaguely related to arsenic. So basically pewter is a really terrible material to make a teapot from. But of course, not all death by teapot was accidental, because tea became an easy way to poison people. And there are loads of examples that I could have chosen, but I've decided to go for two. And one of them comes from the northeast of England, obviously my stomping ground, where we had the notorious murderess and apparently Britain's most prolific female killer, Marianne Cotton. They still don't know exactly how many people she poisoned, but it is believed to be around 21. And she's particularly notorious, and she was knocking about in the 19th century because she kept taking out life insurance policies on her partners and children before they then died rather shortly afterwards of apparent gastric fever. Now, the symptoms of this particularly common disease in that era are incredibly similar to those of arsenic poisoning, so nobody really raised any eyebrows at all these deaths that were going on. And it seems that Cotton used tea as her delivery mechanism. Now, Cotton apparently kept a small teapot specifically for her poisoning, and Beamish Museum in County Durham holds the teapot believed to be hers, and it was a black Wedgwood teapot donated in 1972, and eventually they got a letter from the daughter of the donor which sort of explained its provenance, so they are pretty sure that it is actually hers. And if you watched the ITV dramatisation Dark Angel a few years ago, you'll notice how much they kept putting the emphasis on this teapot. Now, Cotton was finally caught because she tried to get rid of one of her stepchildren to a workhouse, I think it was, but when they wouldn't take them, she'd commented to a local official that she wouldn't be troubled by him for long. And the official then informed the police after the 7-year-old died very soon after, and the autopsy found arsenic in his stomach, so it was good that the official was at least suspicious. Now, this did lead to exhumations of other people close to Cotton, and arsenic was found in their stomachs too. Now, her defence did try to claim that those who had died must have been poisoned by household arsenic, which was particularly present in the dyes used in wallpaper. And this is plausible given how common an ingredient arsenic actually was in a whole range of things. And the Dirty Sexy History podcast has a fantastic episode about arsenic wallpaper, which I'll link in the show notes below. Now, this defence didn't stick because obviously it was nonsense, and she was eventually executed on March 24th, 1873. Now, Marianne Cotton did go on to become the subject of a rather macabre nursery rhyme. Marianne Cotton, she's dead and she's rotten, she lies in her bed with her eyes wide open. Sing, sing, or what should I sing? Marianne Cotton is tied up with string. Where, up in the air, selling black puddings a penny a pair. And obviously this does refer to the fact that she'd been hung. Now, not all poisoners used arsenic, and I want to include this one for a specific reason, because Sarah and Anne Rimmer were charged with an attempt to poison Anne's daughter Elizabeth in 1852 in Liverpool. Notice I said attempted to poison, because Anne and her sister Sarah had made Elizabeth a pot of tea, and Elizabeth essentially noticed that the tea was a lot sweeter than usual, and after drinking it she also suffered burning in her throat and stomach. Because her mother and aunt had threatened to poison her once before, the quick-thinking Elizabeth took the teapot to the druggist, and an analysis of the contents confirmed the presence of oxalic acid. Sarah and Anne Rimmer were then sentenced to death, and thankfully Elizabeth lived to sort of see another day, as it were. So they didn't always use arsenic. Obviously, in this case, it was oxalic acid, and obviously, thankfully, the victim survived. But it did go to show how tea then became quite an obvious way of making sure this person was ingesting the poison. So what do we make of all this folklore of tea then? Well, it is hardly surprising that tea has accrued so much folklore in its long history, because aside from drinking it for comfort, many associate loose tea with reading tea leaves, although this practice seems to have died out with the current boom of interest in runes and tarot cards. Yet it's perhaps tea's use in both magical and mundane remedies that is of most interest, since its price makes it a much more accessible ingredient than most. And this, for me, reminds us that if you do look at a lot of the witchy aesthetic stuff on Instagram, we have to ask ourselves, would cunning folk of bygone centuries really have surrounded them with crystals and expensive ornaments, or would they have worked with what they had to hand in order to do what they needed to do? It's worth bearing in mind. So what I'd like you to do is let me know, what's your favourite kind of tea? How do you take your tea? I mean, if I do drink any, mine's always just black tea with some kind of thing like mango or apple as a flavouring. I cannot drink it with milk at all. But if you drink tea, let me know how you take yours. And also let me know, do you have any unusual uses for tea? So do you use it as like any kind of foot bath or hair rinse or facial rinse or anything like that? That would be really cool to hear. So please do feel free to let me know either on Instagram, on Twitter, anything like that. You can usually get hold of us somewhere. And yeah, so we're going to have a look at the folklore of wine next week, so I hope that you enjoy that one. We will also be doing coffee as well, and I'm a little bit stuck for the last one. If we'll have a look at like cider or possibly mead, it'll be one or the other. So again, let me know if you've got a strong preference either way. But that's kind of what's coming across the rest of April. So I hope you enjoyed that episode, and I will see you next week. As always, there's plenty of extra content if you can afford to support the podcast financially at Patreon. If you can't, please do leave a review or just tell a friend and help get the word out that way, and that is also cool as well. But anyway, I will see you next week. Have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.